George Muller is known as one of the greatest men of prayer and faith who has ever lived. His autobiography, titled The Life of Trust, contains many wonderful stories of how God miraculously provided an answer to prayer throughout George Muller's life. God called him to reach the multitudes of orphans in England. In his lifetime, he built 5 orphanages, cared for over 10,000 orphans, and started 100 schools that provided a Christian education to 120,000 children. But before George Muller could rescue countless children from their desperate condition of abandonment and poverty, God would have to rescue George from the clutches of the cynicism that he held towards his Christian raising. George Muller was born in Germany in 1805, and he was raised in a Lutheran family. His mother died when he was 14 years old, leaving George to be raised by his stable but very strict father. By the time George was in his late teens, he had a very sour attitude towards his parents' religion, and he gave himself to drinking, gambling, and partying. He loved to play cards, and his gambling debts frequently got him into trouble. George Muller's father wanted him to become a Lutheran minister, not for the faith side of it, but for the stability and the prestige that it would bring. So his father paid his way through divinity school at the University of Hull. This didn't change George's lifestyle or his attitude one bit. He went through divinity school with a reputation for drinking and playing cards, and he didn't care who knew it. He made friends with a student named Beta, who was considered by everyone to be a goody-goody. George thought Beta was going to try to teach him to live more righteously, but in reality, Beta wanted to learn from George how to have some fun. They spent a lot of time together, going to parties night after night. Once in a while, George would stop to think about his future. If I don't get serious about my studies and my habits, I'm not going to have much of a life. George didn't much care for the career choice. He'd given little thought to God at all. He just hoped the ministry might provide him with a comfortable living. But whenever he started pondering these questions, his thoughts quickly turned towards his father, which always made him angry and led him to turn his attention to something else. One day, Beta sheepishly said, "George, I won't be playing cards tomorrow night, and don't laugh at me when I tell you why." George said, "Why would I laugh?" "Well," Beta hesitated, "I'm going to a prayer meeting, and I was hoping you'd come with me." George agreed to go, not because he was interested, but because he thought that if he could see this prayer meeting for himself, he'd have lots of ammunition for mocking Beta afterwards. It was a nonconformist prayer meeting. Though not strictly illegal, it was highly frowned upon by the state. They walked into the home of the host and they took their seats. As George looked around the room, he was surprised that the people he saw weren't the timid weaklings that he was accustomed to seeing in religious services. George had no idea that his whole life would be changed by what he was about to see. The leader stood and welcomed the crowd, and then he called upon one of the young men to open the meeting in prayer. George Muller watched as the young man stood to his feet, turned around and faced his chair, and then got on his knees. George had never seen or heard of people kneeling to pray, and he thought, what is he doing? As the man began to talk to God, George thought he felt the presence of some great authority enter the room. For the rest of the meeting, George could only think about the man kneeling in prayer. As they were leaving, George asked Beta, "Why was that man kneeling?" Beta said, "Don't poke fun, George. Let's just leave." But George wasn't joking. He answered his own question. "I know why he was kneeling. He wanted to humble himself before God. He wanted God to know that he's nothing and God is everything. He was expressing to God his great respect and admiration and showing him that he needs him." George Muller went back to his room that night, got on his knees, and prayed for a half hour, asking God to forgive him for his wickedness and to save his soul. He got up off of his knees a different person. Before long, George Muller had surrendered himself to the Lord's service. He went to visit his father, to ask him if he would still support him if he were to transfer from the School of Divinity to the Mission School. His father refused, saying that local ministers made a good living, while missionaries were known for living in poverty. George informed his dad that he would make the switch anyhow and pay his own way. But on the ride back to the university, George realized that he had no money and no income. So, back in his room, he got on his knees and gave the problem to the Lord. A while later, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find one of the leaders of the university standing in the hall with a very impressive man standing beside him. "Mr. Muller, this is Charles Hodge from Princeton University in America. He and 3 of his friends need to learn German, and you're the only person I know who can speak both German and English. They'd like to hire you to teach them." Not only did this pay George Muller's way through college, it also helped launch his lifelong journey of faith and prayer. Christian, God will answer your prayers if you will pray. Stay the course.